"I'm not pretty," she whispered. The cowboy replied. "That's fine. I need honest, not fancy." She learned very early in life how to stay quiet, not because she was shy by nature, but because the world around her made it easier to disappear than to explain herself. In school, teachers remembered her as the girl who always finished her work but never raised her hand. Classmates remembered her only when they needed notes or help. At home, she was the middle child, the one who learned to solve her own problems because attention was always moving somewhere else. No one ever told her she was ugly. No one had to. Life had its own quiet ways of teaching that lesson. When people spoke about beauty, they spoke as if it were a language she didn't understand. Magazines at the grocery store showed faces smooth and perfect. Movies told stories where love arrived for girls who looked a certain way. Even small-town gossip carried the same message. Pretty girls were noticed, chosen, protected. Girls like her were useful, dependable, invisible. She became very good at being useful. By her mid-twenties, she had worked more jobs than she could count. Cleaning houses, helping in diners, sorting supplies at a local feed store. She never stayed long enough to become attached, and she never expected more than a paycheck and a quiet end to the day. When people asked about her dreams, she smiled politely and changed the subject. Dreaming felt dangerous. It made disappointment sharper. She rented a small room behind an old couple's house on the edge of town. The walls were thin, the furniture mismatched, but it was cheap and peaceful. At night, she often sat by the small window, listening to the sound of wind moving through dry grass, thinking about nothing in particular. Thinking too much only reminded her of what she believed she lacked. One afternoon, while helping unload supplies at the feed store, she overheard two men talking about a ranch a few miles outside town. The owner had lost a worker and needed temporary help. The pay wasn't great, but meals were included and the work was honest. Honest work mattered to her. She didn't know anything about ranch life beyond what she had seen from a distance: open land, fences, animals moving slowly under the sun. It seemed hard, lonely, and simple, all things she could handle. That evening, she asked the store owner about it. He gave her a phone number written on the back of a receipt and warned her that the man who owned the ranch wasn't easy. Quiet, serious, not much patience for excuses. She nodded. Excuses were not something she relied on. The next morning, she stood outside the small post office, phone pressed to her ear, heart beating harder than usual. When the call connected, a man's voice answered. Deep, calm, careful with words. She explained who she was and why she was calling. There was a pause long enough for her to prepare herself for rejection. Instead, he asked when she could start. 2 days later, she walked up the long dirt road leading to the ranch. Dust clung to her shoes. The sky stretched wide above her, empty and bright. She carried a small bag with clothes and a notebook where she wrote down tasks so she wouldn't forget anything. The ranch was older than she expected. The buildings showed signs of wear but not neglect. Everything had its place. Fences stood firm. Tools were cleaned and stacked neatly. It felt like a place shaped by routine and responsibility. She saw him near the barn, fixing a loose board. He was taller than she imagined, his movements slow and steady, as if he never rushed anything. He looked up when he noticed her and studied her for a moment, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with quiet attention. "You must be the one from town," he said. She nodded and introduced herself. Her voice came out softer than she intended. He explained the work without exaggeration. Long hours, physical effort, no room for laziness. She listened carefully, already sorting the tasks in her mind. "I can do it," she said simply. That seemed to be enough. Her days quickly fell into rhythm. Mornings started early. She helped with feeding, cleaning, repairs, and whatever else needed doing. The work was tiring, but there was a strange comfort in it. At the end of each day, she could see what she had accomplished. There was no pretending, no guessing whether she had done enough. The cowboy didn't speak much, but when he did, his words mattered. He didn't shout or criticize unnecessarily. If something was done wrong, he showed her how to fix it. If something was done right, he nodded and moved on. That quiet approval meant more to her than praise ever had. She noticed things about him as days passed. How he always checked the fences before sunset. How he remembered small details without writing them down. How he treated animals with patience, never forcing more than necessary. He carried his past like a closed book, present but not offered. Evenings were the quietest. After dinner, they often sat on opposite sides of the long table, tired but calm. Sometimes silence stretched between them. Other times, he asked simple questions about her day or her work history. She answered honestly, without trying to sound impressive. One evening, as the sky turned orange and shadows grew longer, they stayed outside after finishing repairs. The air was cooler and the land felt endless. She stood awkwardly, unsure whether to speak or leave. Without planning to, she said, "I'm not pretty." The words surprised even her. They slipped out like a truth that had been waiting too long. She didn't look at him when she said it. She stared at the ground, already feeling foolish. For a moment, she feared she had crossed an invisible line, that she had said something uncomfortable or strange. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was calm, almost thoughtful. "That's fine," he said. "I need honest, not fancy." She looked up, confused. His face showed no judgment, no pity, just certainty. He explained that life on a ranch didn't care about appearances. Animals didn't respond to pretty words. Land didn't improve because someone looked good standing on it. What mattered was showing up, telling the truth, and doing the work even when no one was watching. She listened, her chest tight in a way she didn't understand. No one had ever answered her insecurity like that. No one had ever treated it as something neutral instead of something to fix. That night, lying on her narrow bed, she stared at the ceiling for a long time. His words replayed in her mind. Honest, not fancy. She realized how much of her life had been spent apologizing for taking up space, for not meeting an invisible standard she never agreed to. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without feeling small. Outside, the ranch settled into silence, unaware that something quiet but important had shifted. The next morning began like all the others, with the sky still pale and the air cool enough to make her pull her jacket tighter around herself. She woke before the alarm, a habit she had learned from years of trying not to be late, not to be noticed for the wrong reasons. For a moment she lay still, listening to the quiet sounds of the ranch waking up, the distant movement of animals, the soft creak of wood, the wind brushing against the walls. But something felt different. The words from the night before stayed with her. Honest, not fancy. They did not fade with sleep the way most thoughts did. Instead, they sat calmly in her mind, like a small light she hadn't known she was missing. She got dressed and stepped outside. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the land in soft colors. She breathed deeply, feeling grounded in a way she hadn't felt in years. There was work to do, and for once she felt ready without feeling small. He was already outside, checking the fence line. He gave her a brief nod when he saw her, the same as always, but she noticed something new in herself. She did not look away quickly. She did not feel the need to shrink. They worked side by side most of the morning, fixing small issues that could become bigger problems if ignored. He didn't explain everything anymore. He trusted her to see what needed to be done. That trust felt heavy and meaningful in her hands. At one point, she made a mistake while organizing supplies. She noticed it before he did and corrected it quietly. When he came by later and saw the change, he paused. "Good catch," he said. It was only 2 words, but they stayed with her longer than any long speech ever had. As days passed, their routine settled into something steady. They spoke more, though never too much. Their conversations were simple, about weather, repairs, animals, the slow changes of the land. He never asked questions that felt intrusive. She never felt pressure to impress him. It was a kind of balance she had never experienced before. She began to notice how he watched the world. He paid attention without staring, listened without interrupting. When she spoke, he didn't rush her. That alone made her feel seen. One afternoon, while they were repairing a broken gate, the heat grew heavy. She wiped her forehead and laughed softly at herself for underestimating the work. He looked at her, curious. "You always work like you've got something to prove," he said, not unkindly. The words made her pause. She thought about denying it, about brushing it off with a joke. Instead, she told the truth. "I guess I always felt like I had to earn my place," she said. He nodded slowly as if that made sense to him. "Some people learn that early," he replied. "Doesn't mean they should carry it forever." She didn't respond, but something loosened inside her chest. It was strange how he spoke, as if change were possible, not dramatic or sudden, but real. That evening, they ate dinner later than usual. The day had been long and they were both tired. As they sat across from each other, the quiet didn't feel awkward. It felt earned. She found herself talking more than she usually did. She told him about her childhood, not the painful details, but the feeling of always standing just outside of attention. He listened without judgment, his eyes steady. When she finished, she waited for the familiar discomfort that usually followed honesty. It didn't come. Instead, he said, "You notice things others miss. That matters." No one had ever described her that way before. The ranch slowly began to improve under their shared effort. Small repairs added up. Tasks became smoother. There was a sense of order that hadn't been there before. She took pride in it, not loudly but deeply. One day, a delivery arrived earlier than expected. He wasn't around, and the driver seemed impatient. Without hesitation, she stepped in, handled the paperwork, and organized the drop-off efficiently. When he returned and saw everything in place, he asked what happened. She explained calmly. He looked at her for a long moment. "You handled it better than I would have," he said. That night, she sat alone outside, watching the stars appear one by one. She thought about how different she felt compared to when she first arrived. She hadn't changed her appearance. She hadn't become someone new. Yet something inside her had shifted. She realized she wasn't constantly waiting to be dismissed anymore. Over the next few weeks, he began asking for her opinion, not just on small things but on decisions that mattered, where to focus repairs, how to manage time better, whether to take on extra work or let things rest. At first, she hesitated, afraid of being wrong. But he never punished honesty. If an idea didn't work, they adjusted. There was no blame. Slowly, she learned that being honest didn't mean being perfect. It meant being present. One evening, while walking back from the far edge of the property, the sky darkened unexpectedly. A storm rolled in fast. They hurried back, rain beginning to fall. By the time they reached shelter, both were soaked and laughing quietly at the surprise. As they stood there, catching their breath, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. Not excitement, not fear, just comfort. She realized then that what was growing between them wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was built from small moments, shared work, quiet understanding, respect. Later that night, she wrote in her notebook, something she hadn't done in a long time. She didn't write plans or lists. She wrote a single sentence. "I am allowed to take up space." The words felt true in a way she had never felt before. Outside, the ranch rested under the rain, steady and unchanged, while inside her, something strong and patient was taking root. Time passed on the ranch in a way she had never experienced before. Days did not rush her, and they did not drag her down either. They moved forward with purpose, shaped by sunrise and sunset, by work that needed to be done and rest that was earned. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like she was waiting for something better to begin. This felt like living, not just surviving. She noticed changes in herself before anyone else did. She stood straighter. She spoke a little louder. When problems appeared, she faced them instead of doubting herself first. The quiet confidence growing inside her did not feel forced. It felt natural, like something that had always been there but had never been allowed space. The cowboy noticed too, though he never said it directly. He began trusting her with more responsibility. He left her in charge when he had to go into town. He asked her to handle schedules, supplies, and decisions that once rested only on his shoulders. Each time he did, she felt the weight of it, but also the pride. One afternoon, a disagreement came up about repairing an old structure near the edge of the land. He believed it could wait. She thought it would cause problems if ignored. In the past, she would have stayed quiet, afraid of sounding foolish. This time, she explained her reasoning clearly, pointing out signs of damage he had overlooked. He listened carefully. After a long pause, he nodded. "You're right," he said. "Let's fix it now." The moment stayed with her long after the work was done. Being heard felt powerful, but being trusted felt even stronger. As weeks turned into months, she began to understand him better too. He was not distant by nature. He was careful. Life had taught him that words mattered, that promises should be few and kept. He had learned to rely on himself, not because he didn't value others, but because trust had once come at a cost. Sometimes, late in the evening, he would share small pieces of his past. Not dramatic stories, just moments. How he had taken over the ranch younger than planned. How mistakes had been expensive, not just financially but emotionally. He never spoke badly about anyone, but she could hear the lessons behind his silence. She never pushed for more. She understood now that honesty did not mean forcing truth out of someone. It meant allowing it to arrive when ready. One day, she made a serious mistake. A simple decision led to extra work and wasted time. When she realized what had happened, her stomach tightened. Old fears rushed back, the fear of being judged, dismissed, replaced. She went to him immediately and explained what had gone wrong. He listened, then sighed slowly. "All right," he said, "let's fix it." That was it. No anger, no disappointment, just action. As they worked together to correct the mistake, she felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest, relief mixed with gratitude. She realized she was not being measured by perfection here, but by honesty and effort. That night, she sat alone again, looking out at the open land. She thought about how many years she had spent believing she needed to become someone else to deserve respect. How exhausting that belief had been, how wrong. She was learning that value did not come from appearance or approval. It came from consistency, care, and truth. Their connection deepened quietly. There were no dramatic moments, no grand gestures. Instead, there were shared mornings, inside jokes formed over repeated tasks, comfortable silence that didn't demand filling. Sometimes, she caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. Not with judgment, not with expectation, but with a kind of steady awareness. It didn't make her nervous, it made her feel secure. One evening after finishing work late, they sat outside together. The sky was wide and full of stars. The land felt endless yet safe. She spoke without thinking too much. "I don't feel invisible here." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. "You never were." The words stayed with her, settling deep. She began to imagine a future without fear, not a perfect one, but a real one. One where she didn't measure herself against others. One where she belonged because she chose to stay, not because she tried to earn permission. The ranch continued to change under their care, but the biggest change was inside her. She no longer whispered apologies for existing. She no longer believed she had to be less. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that being honest had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Change did not arrive loudly. It came in small moments that added up over time. She noticed it one morning when she caught her reflection in the old mirror by the sink. Nothing about her face had changed. Her hair was the same. Her clothes were worn from work. But her eyes looked different. They no longer carried the habit of looking away first. She stood there for a second longer than usual, then turned and went outside to start the day. Work had become something she looked forward to. Not because it was easy, but because it felt meaningful. Every task had a purpose. Every effort left a mark. The ranch was no longer just a place she worked. It felt like a place she belonged. The cowboy relied on her more than ever now. He trusted her instincts, even when they differed from his own. When problems came up, they discussed them as equals. That alone changed how she saw herself. She was no longer just helping, she was contributing. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by unexpectedly. He spoke mostly to the cowboy at first, barely acknowledging her presence. Old feelings tried to rise in her chest, but she pushed them aside. When the conversation turned to repairs and planning, she stepped in calmly and shared her thoughts. The neighbor looked surprised, then thoughtful. He nodded at her ideas and asked follow-up questions. After he left, she felt a strange mix of pride and peace. She had not forced herself forward. She had simply spoken when it mattered. Later that evening, the cowboy said, "You handled that well." She smiled, small but genuine. Compliments no longer made her uncomfortable. She was learning to accept them without questioning her worth. As weeks passed, she realized she no longer counted the days until something better came along. She was no longer waiting to leave. That realization scared her at first. Commitment had always felt risky. But this felt different. It felt earned. The cowboy began opening up more too, not all at once, but little by little. He talked about the loneliness that came with responsibility, about nights spent worrying whether the ranch would survive another year, about how trust had once been broken and how careful he had become since then. She listened without trying to fix anything. She understood now that listening itself was a form of care. One evening, after a long day, they sat together quietly. The sky was heavy with clouds, the air calm before rain. She felt the urge to speak, then hesitated. "What happens when this job ends?" she asked softly. He looked at her, not surprised by the question. "It doesn't have to," he said, "if you want to stay." The words settled between them. He wasn't offering promises or pressure, just an option. She thought about her old room behind the couple's house, about drifting from job to job, about never planning too far ahead because nothing ever felt solid. "This feels like home," she said finally. He nodded as if he had already known. From that point on, something shifted again, not in how they worked but in how they shared space. Meals felt warmer. Silence felt deeper. They understood each other without explanation. She noticed how he always made sure she ate first when days were long, how he remembered small preferences without being told. These gestures were quiet, but they mattered. One night, a storm rolled in stronger than expected. Wind shook the buildings. Rain came down hard. They worked together to secure everything, moving with practiced trust. When it was over, both soaked and tired, they laughed quietly under the shelter. In that moment, she realized she felt safe, not protected in a dramatic way, but respected. That safety came from knowing she was valued, not judged. Later, as they sat waiting for the storm to pass, she spoke again. "I used to think being chosen meant someone liked how you looked." He listened carefully. "Now I think it means someone sees how you live," she continued. He didn't respond with words. He simply nodded, his expression calm and sure. Days later, she made another mistake, smaller than before, but enough to cause inconvenience. This time, she noticed something new. She didn't panic. She didn't shrink. She owned it and fixed it. That was when she realized how far she had come. The ranch flourished not because everything was perfect, but because it was cared for. And she realized that was true for people too. She no longer whispered doubts to herself at night. She no longer compared her worth to anyone else's. She had learned that honesty had built something real, something strong. As autumn approached, the land changed color. The air grew cooler. Evenings became quieter. Sitting outside, wrapped in a light jacket, she felt content in a way she had never known before. She wasn't fancy. She wasn't perfect. But she was honest. And for the first time in her life, that felt like more than enough. The season changed slowly, almost without notice. Mornings became cooler, and the sky held a softer light. The land rested more than it worked, and the ranch moved at a gentler pace. She found comfort in that rhythm. It felt like a quiet reward for everything that had come before. She woke one morning with a clear thought that surprised her. She was no longer afraid of the future. That fear had followed her for most of her life. Fear of being left behind. Fear of not being enough. Fear of needing something she was never meant to have. But now, standing at the edge of the day with boots on her feet and work waiting, she felt steady. The cowboy noticed it too. He saw how she moved with ease, how decisions came naturally to her now. He no longer checked behind her work. He didn't need to. Trust had become part of their daily life, as normal as breathing. One afternoon, while fixing a fence together, he stopped and leaned on the post. "I couldn't do this alone anymore," he said quietly. She looked at him, surprised by the honesty. "I know," she replied. "That's why we make a good team." The words felt right, not heavy, not dramatic, just true. They never had a moment where everything changed at once. There was no sudden declaration, no big turning point. Instead, there was a series of small choices made every day. Choosing to listen, choosing to stay, choosing honesty over fear. She thought back to the girl she used to be, the one who believed beauty decided her value. That girl would not have believed this life was possible. She would not have believed that someone could care more about how she showed up than how she looked. But life had proven her wrong. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, the cowboy pulled out a few papers. He explained that he wanted to make things official. Not in a rushed way, not in a way that trapped either of them, just clarity. "I want you here," he said, "not as help, as someone who belongs." Her chest tightened, but this time it wasn't fear, it was relief. "I already feel like I belong," she said, "but I'd like that." They talked late into the night, about responsibilities, about boundaries, about what they both wanted and didn't want. There were no unrealistic promises, just honest expectations. That conversation meant more to her than any romantic idea she had once imagined. It showed respect, it showed care. Life continued as it always does. Some days were easier than others. There were challenges, disagreements, moments of tired silence, but none of it felt threatening. They handled problems together calmly, without blame. She learned that real connection wasn't about constant happiness. It was about facing reality without pretending. One morning, a visitor stopped by the ranch, a woman who had known the cowboy years ago. She looked at her with curiosity, then smiled warmly. There was no comparison, no judgment, just kindness. After the visitor left, she realized something important. She no longer measured herself against anyone else. The old habit had faded. She had stopped asking, "Am I enough?" As winter approached, evenings grew quieter. They spent more time indoors, planning for the months ahead. She shared ideas freely now, and he listened. Decisions were shared, not carried alone. One night, sitting by the window, she thought about the words she had once whispered. "I'm not pretty." They no longer felt painful. They no longer defined her. She understood now that beauty was never the point. Honesty was. The ranch stood strong through the colder days, not because everything was perfect, but because it was cared for with patience and truth. And so were they. She found herself smiling more, laughing easily, not because life had become easy, but because she trusted it now. On a quiet evening with the land resting under a calm sky, the cowboy looked at her and said, "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I," she replied. There was no need to say more. She had found a place where she didn't have to become someone else to be valued, a place where honesty was enough, a place where being real mattered more than being fancy. And in that simple truth, she finally felt at home.